In 2003, my school friend was bullied out of town for wanting to become a spider. Last week, she came home. On Tuesday evening, when Tia Greenwood and Matt Walker went missing, the final strands of our threadbare town unravelled. Of course, we'd been coming undone for 2 decades, ever since Helen Cavendish ran away at the age of 10. But it wasn't her fault. Wasn't even simply her classmates' fault, truth be told. All the townsfolk were culpable, in one way or another. And all of us will pay. I tried to get out once. In 2014, I earned my journalism degree from Cambridge. However, by 2020, London had chewed me up. The capital tried to work me through its steel-lined stomach, but had to spew me out. An oddball from the North Country, no matter how dazzling his credentials, doesn't really belong there. I hardly belonged in Spitheap. That was what my friends and I used to call this town. I have Mr. Fisher, my old German teacher, to thank for that. "Why did you even move here, Wren?" Mrs. Caldwell asked her colleague in the school corridor. Mr. Fisher grumbled and shrugged his shoulders. "Heaven knows, Ash. This place is a heap." "Don't you mean a scheisse heap?" I loudly chirped behind the chattering teachers, sparking a round of laughter from my friends. The flustered Mr. Fisher, realising that we had been eavesdropping, then told a blatant lie. "That's not appropriate, Jessie Black. And for your information, I said spit heap." The teacher then rewarded me with a demerit and a detention. Anyway, that was a tangent. Things changed last Tuesday, and when they changed all at once. Not dominoes falling one by one, but a house of cards buckling and collapsing. When 3 more townsfolk went missing on Wednesday, people started accusing one another of foul play, accusing neighbours and co-workers they'd never liked much. Spitheap's Facebook group became a dumpster fire of baseless claims, as nobody knew what was happening. Even the mayor fled to his apartment in the city, sealing Spitheap's dysfunctional state of operations. Hysteria and lies spread. The authorities did nothing to stop that. We're far from civilization out here, far from rules and accountability. Besides, gossip and police officers are synonymous in a small town. They both meander and deal in half-truths. By Friday evening, I'd started to put together an article, not just for the Spitheap paper, but for my blog. I knew I had a limited amount of time before the story became national news, so I wasn't wasting a second of it. 5 people had gone missing from a small town. I typed as I walked along country lanes, from the newspaper's one-room office to my parents' house, which had become my house once again when I returned to my hometown, tail between my legs. Dusk was passing, its orange heart swallowed by the sky's black overbite. The snow-capped tops of the alder trees in Spitheap's woodland bled under the glow of the setting sun. For once, I saw not beauty, but a hellscape. I found no comfort in the blistering weather. Instead, I cast my eyes back to my phone and continued typing my article with fast-moving digits, skin red and numb from that sub-zero evening. There were pockets of missing information in my draft, of course, so it was far too shallow to go to print, but I'd done my best to fill the gaps. Constable Jordan Merton had a loose tongue, and on Friday afternoon he let something slip to Alan, a friend of mine. Something that probably should have been kept under wraps. "Merton will kill me when you publish this," Alan pointed out. They found something strange in Matt Walker's house. Rope, painted white. Filthy, thin, cobweb-coated rope. I frowned. What? I don't know, Jesse, Alan said. But I think we should get out of town for a bit, you know? Until all of this blows over. 5 people have vanished in 2 days. This killer doesn't seem to be a normal person with... Killer! I loudly interrupted. Come on, Alan. We don't know that. They're missing. We might still find them, alive and well. Do you want to know what else Constable Merton told me? My friend asked. My skin felt a little clammy as I started to dread what my friend might tell me next. I nodded, nonetheless. You know Matt lives with his sister, Blair, right? Alan asked. Well, in her interview to the police, she said that she saw something on her drive home, minutes before she found her brother's blood in the house. She saw something in the road, an animal, but not one she recognised, not a dog, not a wild fox, nothing that would make sense in these parts, in any parts. Blair said that this thing skittered in stiff, janky movements across the lane, moved so slowly that she had to swerve the car out the way. In fact, she said... My friend wore a 1,000-yard stare for several seconds. Then I hoarsely whispered, What? What did she say? She said the thing looked at her, and its face almost seemed human, Alan said. I thought about Blair's version of events as I walked up the darkening tarmac towards my parents' home on the outskirts of town. I jotted down notes of her story, told to me by Alan. I did plan to verify the facts. I planned to interview Blair myself, but I was impatient. I had to write then and there. The prose flowed from my giddy fingers, crushing anything else I'd ever written, because this story was my magnum opus. Nothing ever happens in this town. This was going to make me a journalist. I was sure of that. The road beneath my feet wasn't the only thing I ignored, but eventually the smell of burning wood drew my eyes up from my phone, and I jolted in panic. Over the trees, about a quarter mile up the road, rose a billowing, fattening plume of smoke. It was coming from Farmer Ryan Gleason's property, which sat only another quarter mile from my parents' house. I was surprised not to hear sirens until I remembered that I didn't live in the city anymore. Thinking of my elderly parents just up the road, I pelted forwards, dashing at a pace that hurt my legs and lungs. The smoke didn't help, of course, but I kept pushing until the blaze came into view. I gasped when I saw that the house, barn, and all other structures on the farmer's property were ablaze. It wasn't the crumbling infrastructure that frightened me, not even the smoke, full of particles that scorched my lungs lining. It was the driveway, painted with streaks of blood that encircled Farmer Gleason's pickup truck. A truck which, given its open doors, had clearly been abandoned. At this point, there finally sounded distant sirens, so I stopped dialing 999. I imagined, even in such an isolated location, that dozens of people must have seen the smoke cloud. Dozens of people must have called the emergency services. Anyhow, I followed the trail of blood to the trees surrounding Gleason Farm. I wasn't sure why the slender trunks stung my teary pupils, but I knew smoke had nothing to do with it. Knew that before the cluster of alders, unhealthily narrow, suddenly shifted sideways. Illuminated by the raging flames, there lurked a nude, muddy, fleshy thing with bent appendages, 4 long and 4 short. Though its face was hard to discern through the shade and smoke, the thing undoubtedly watched me. It was, in some sense, undeniably human. Blair Walker's story was true. When the creature started to scuttle speedily to the right, disappearing into the forest, I ran up the road in pursuit of it. I don't know why I didn't turn and flee. And a mere half-minute later, there came smashes, thuds and screams from 100 yards up the road. But by the time I had reached the driveway of my parents' home, the storm of sound had already passed, had punctured the living room window, leaving jagged shards of glass in the vacant frame, like uneven teeth. The lounge's overhead light shone brightly, revealing bloodstains across the sofa and the carpet. My parents were gone. I wailed inconsolably as I spun to survey my surroundings, and then I immediately noted the disturbed shrubbery beside the driveway. Immediately reminded myself that I'd seen this particular bush in a trampled and forlorn state before. In the past, I'd just blamed a wild animal, and I hadn't been entirely wrong. Lighting the way with my phone's torch beam, I stepped over the flattened threshold into the woodland. A 100-yard trail of mushed circular footprints led me to a hovel in the mud. When I shakily shone my light inside, it highlighted a curved tunnel that had been burrowed by something far too large to be a badger, far too large to be anything that came to mind. I remembered what Alan had said. An animal, but not one she recognised. Not a dog, not a wild fox, nothing that would make sense in these parts. In any parts. My friend's words ran through my head as I dropped into the near vertical entrance, and once I'd slipped down the curve, I found myself crouching in a level passageway, slightly wider than the entrance. It needed to be wider to make way for something that made me heave. Propped against the side of the dirt tunnel in a sitting position was a skeleton. It wore faded denim jeans and a rucked, stripy top, sinking into the gaps between rib bones. The skull's jaw hung loosely, as if the woman had died screaming. I only really knew for sure that it was a woman because a wooden plank shot from the mud beside her corpse. Words had been etched into the grooves of the makeshift gravestone. Dr. Victoria Quincy, 1975 to 2020. I was your muse, and you were mine. Thank you for making me, but nobody will unmake me. Shuddering uncontrollably after reading that haunting passage, I pressed onwards. I only took a few steps before my tightly shut lips finally opened to release a scream. At the end of the tunnel, only 20 yards ahead, was that thing. That deformed, 8-limbed thing that I'd seen amongst the trees. Up close, I saw that its short legs, each a foot in length, weren't legs at all. They were stringy pieces of immovable flesh that seemed only to serve an aesthetic purpose. As for the 4 long appendages, only 2 were legs, the other 2 were arms, and all had been extended to twice the typical length of human parts. A rounded nub sat at the end of each limb, except for the arm which still bore a human hand, kept for practical purposes. The torso had been tightened in the middle, reshaping the creature's midsection into 2 bumpy ovals, and its face bore 2 additional eyes, again only serving an aesthetic purpose. But the mouth was the most horrid. It had been surgically altered to feature sideways lips, and all human teeth had been removed. Instead, there protruded 2 chiseled fangs made from a dull metal coated in blood. The creature looked clearer than before. She looked clearer. "Helen?" I blubbered. My old friend did not say a word, could not say a word, as she had removed her tongue. But I recognised those eyes, recognised something in that mutilated face. Yes, it was Helen Cavendish. After she'd observed me with a tilted head, while swaying on her long limbs, the creature grunted gutturally and backed away, skitting in reverse on those 4 monstrous legs, the shorter ones bouncing uselessly from the sides of her bumpy, segmented torso. Helen slipped into the shadows, beyond the reach of my torchlight, and something told me that I shouldn't follow, that I wouldn't like what I'd find. But I followed anyway. And there, amongst the mutilated corpses of the missing townsfolk, were the still twitching bodies of my mother and father. I whined animalistically as Helen opened her lopsided mouth and plunged her metal fangs into the crown of my mother's head. My father, lying beside her on a bloody mound of corpses, dozily twisted his head. Twisted to watch Helen feast on his wife. He managed only to mumble something incomprehensible, which was probably for the best, but I only truly registered one thing. The back of Dad's head was gone. Ellen had taken a clump of his hair, skin, skull, and grey matter. My father started to fade, and I instead watched my mother. Watched her stare directly at me with half-knowing eyes. She was still alive in some way. Alive in some very, very small part. "Flesh in the grape tower," Mum groaned loosely and nonsensically, eyes rolling into the back of her head. What remained of her head. "Stop!" I screamed at the monster digesting chunks of my mother's brain. The spider halted, mid-munch, then shot its head towards me with a lightning reflex, with eyes that had forgotten their humanity. This wasn't the friend I'd lost at the age of 10, and it was clear that I wasn't her friend either. I spun, bumping my head on the hard dirt of the tunnel ceiling, and hurried back up the passageway's curve as nubby limbs near soundlessly scuttled along the dirt behind me. The soft thumps of those rounded skin pores reverberated off the tunnel walls as I scrambled up the vertical entrance. When I emerged from that nightmarish underworld, lungs filling with smoke from the forest above, I started to follow the muddy tracks back to the driveway, back towards the fire. And as I scurried across the dirt, hunted by my feral once friend, I set my sights on the Hyundai ahead. But as my shoe soles hit the tarmac and freedom hit my tongue, there came the grip of something against my nape. Not a rounded knob, but emaciated fingers. I screamed and tripped into the driver's door of my waiting car, thumping my head against the metal and crumpling to the ground. There she stood, revealed by the property's exterior motion lighting. Helen Cavendish, an 8-legged abomination. Far from a spider, though I wouldn't have dreamt of telling her that. She was a vengeful spirit that had returned after 21 years to hunt those who had mocked her. Even my own dear parents, who had merely chuckled playfully when Helen confessed her dream of becoming an arachnid. I was slouching, dazed and confused against the side of my car, not even bothering to search for my keys, as all seemed to be lost. The spider creature's remaining human hand reached its probing, dancing fingers towards me. Dirty, overgrown nails scraped painfully through my brunette hair, dragging their way through flesh towards the back of my head. They drew blood, then eventually found purchase in the part of my crown that would, soon enough, become Helen's meal. By some miracle, however, the distant sirens of a fire engine started to sound not so distant at all. The approaching fire had spread from Gleason's farm to my parents' property, much like the fire engine. The lights and sounds spooked the horrifying creature, and its nails suddenly lifted from my skin, moments before I met my end. By the time the responders found me, shivering on the driveway, the creature had fled. I know I should do the same, but I won't leave, won't let my parents' deaths mean nothing. The hovel's empty now, other than the mound of corpses. I showed the detectives, and they are following it up. But I know they won't solve this. Somebody has to stop her. 10 more townsfolk have gone missing. It no longer matters who mocked my friend and who didn't. After all, I always supported her dream, but that thing didn't care. It's not Helen. Not anymore.